all that stuff. It's crazy.
Wow. At your height of your travel schedule, how often did you go out of town?
Well, before the pandemic, I had 2 years where I was only home 10 days a month for a 7 or 8 month period. So I was really booking it back then. Then the pandemic hit, and actually, a lot of orchestras closed down during the pandemic because there was going to be nobody in the theater. You couldn't have people. That was all over the country. But orchestras decided they needed to stay relevant, and they wanted to do something. So within the guidelines of social distancing, and which affected how many people could be on stage, orchestras got into streaming. So they were trying to still reach their subscriber base by saying, hey, you can now watch us on Friday night live. We're going to be doing a live concert. And we were limited to the number of players we could have on stage because of, social distancing rules. So I actually had to write a ton of music for small orchestra because not a lot of music exists for that. So I'll never forget. So anyway, before I get to that, during the pandemic, I was traveling, and my wife and my manager both said, you're out of your mind, because this is before testing, before vaccines. So, I was masking up and gloving up and all the stuff that we find out later really didn't make a difference anyway. And I was flying, and I was going to Detroit and Dallas and places, and we were doing these streaming concerts. So we were playing in a theater, a 2,000-seat theater, to nobody except cameras, and there was no music. So I created a couple of concerts. One was a ragtime concert, and it was music of Scott Joplin, Jelly Roll Morton, W.C. Handy, all this kind of early jazz, which was kind of written for small orchestras anyway. That's kind of was the nature of the music. So I put a concert together with that was very successful. And then the Detroit Symphony wanted to have this group, Troupe Vertigo, which is a Cirque group, come and perform for streaming. And they do all these classical masterworks, like, Dvorak symphonic dances and, all these different pieces that are for full orchestra. So I had to take those pieces, which are written for full orchestra, and condense them so that they could be played by 24 people and still sound real, still sound right, which, it took hundreds of hours. And so I ended up writing a lot of music during that time period. So we would do these concerts, we'd play this big piece would finish dead silence. Nobody in the hall, and then you turn around and there's a camera out there and I'd have to talk to the camera. And so then they started letting in a 2,000-seat hall, 50 people. So, and they would sit, like 40 feet apart, like all over the hall. And I'll tell you one thing, 50 people, when they're clapping, can make a hell of a racket in a 2,000-seat room, So then we'd play, and there would be 50 people, and we would be still streaming. And I'll never forget that Buffalo asked me if I would come and help them out, because the conductor that they normally used was quarantined and couldn't come. So I went there and did a few weeks. But one of them, some of the restrictions had lifted, and we actually had 250 people in the audience. And the orchestra people were crying. Because people were back in the room. We had, this kinetic energy that happens between the listener and the musicians. It hadn't been there for months and months. And all of a sudden there were people, and it was like, it was unbelievable, the emotion on stage. So that was a pretty crazy time period. So anyway, since the pandemic, after that, I've cut back a bit. But before the pandemic, it's a long answer to a short question. I'm sorry, but I was out there that one year, man. I came home and I'd unpack, and like 5 days later, I'm gone again, and then sometimes I'd be gone for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. So I'm a little over that, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I gotcha. I have a couple of different questions about your long answer there. I thought I'm wondering, you've played in front of, it's a 2,000 seat uh, auditorium you were in. I'm assuming you've played in larger places. How do you compare being in a packed crowd, in front of a packed crowd, a sparsely filled crowd versus no one? What's the sensation in all three environments?
Well, when you're playing for no one, you're totally focused on the musicians in front of you, and uh, you're concentrating on doing what we need to do together to make this music come alive. And it can be, you're not distracted by anything else. You're not distracted by any person, by any visual that's going on. It's like you're in a recording studio and you're totally focused on the music. So you can create really great music that way, and the musicians communicate with each other as they do. In a full house, there's a new element. If you imagine, here's the orchestra, and here is the audience, and here is the conductor. I'm in the middle between the orchestra and the audience. And the energy that flows between the orchestra and the audience is just unbelievable, because even if people are not, in a pop concert, if somebody plays a jazz solo, people are going to applaud during the piece, that kind of a thing. But if we're playing some big classical piece, people are going to applaud at the end, not take part. But you can still feel the energy in the room of the listeners. If you are tweaking the listeners, you can feel their emotion, their energy, even if they're not applauding or yelling or something, So that experience takes it to a whole new level, because humans are, we're putting out this ethereal thing called sound, and that is touching the spirit and the soul of the people in the room, and there is an energy coming back, and I'm standing right in the middle of it. So that is electric. When it's a sparse house, I think there is a tendency when musicians walk out on stage, at first, they're like, oh, it's a small crowd tonight, for about 2 minutes. And then everybody is like, you know what? It doesn't matter if there's one person out there. We're going to play our hearts out for that one person, And then you kind of get to that place where you might think initially you might feel, well, there's not going to be as much energy in the room, but it's kind of a hybrid sort of between the huge crowd and the nobody, and then you work the energy. The energy is still palpable in that group of people. And sometimes a smaller crowd is even more effusive than a large crowd. It's hard to pick on it. So to me, look, to walk on stage is a privilege. It always has been. To get to walk into a room and create sound and touch the human spirit of whoever's in the room is a privilege to get to do that. So to me, it's always a special experience, but there are these elements